3 seasons ago, I set up a simple barrier system around my garden beds using a method I picked up from an Amish family in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And that year, I lost exactly 0 transplants to flying pests and saw a 90% reduction in leaf damage across my tomatoes, peppers, squash, and brassicas compared to the year before. 0 sprays, 0 chemicals. Just a physical barrier done the way the Amish have been doing it for generations. And it kept every major pest out from May through September. Before that, I was the guy buying row cover fabric every spring, draping it wrong, watching it blow off in the first storm, and then giving up by June and going back to spraying neem oil every 5 days like clockwork. I spent more time fighting bugs than I did harvesting food, and I know a lot of you have been right there with me. Then I visited a family garden outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, and I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Their beds were covered with these simple, elegant hoop and fabric structures that looked almost homemade because they were, and underneath them, the plants were pristine. I mean dark green, vigorous, untouched leaves on cabbage and broccoli that should have been riddled with holes by mid-July. I asked the eldest son how they built them, and he walked me through the whole setup in about 10 minutes. Today, I am going to show you exactly how to build and use this Amish pest barrier system in your own garden. It works on raised beds, in ground rows, and even in containers. And stay with me to the end, because I will share a lesser-known Amish technique for sealing the barrier at ground level that solves the one problem most row cover setups have, and it uses something you probably already have in your shed. Now, I want to be honest about something. For most of my gardening life, I thought physical barriers were a lazy shortcut. I figured real gardeners dealt with pests through knowledge, through companion, planting, and beneficial insects, and well-timed sprays. I looked at row covers as training wheels, something beginners used because they had not learned the real skills yet. I was wrong about that for a long time. If you have felt the same way, I understand completely. I held that attitude for close to 20 years before I saw what the Amish were actually doing and realized their barrier system was not a shortcut at all. It was the foundation of their entire pest management approach. Everything else they did, the companion planting, the beneficial insects, the soil building, all of it worked better because the barrier handled the first and hardest wave of pest pressure during the most vulnerable weeks of the growing season. Spending time around those Lancaster County gardens reset my thinking entirely. I stopped seeing barriers as a crutch and started seeing them as the smartest first line of defense a gardener can build. Let me give you some context for why the Amish approach barriers this way. When you visit a working Amish garden, one of the first things you notice is scale. These are not hobby plots. These are families of 8, 10, sometimes 12 people who depend on that garden for a significant portion of their yearly food. Every row has to produce. Every plant matters. They cannot afford to lose a bed of cabbages to imported cabbage worms or watch a whole planting of squash get decimated by cucumber beetles in the first 3 weeks after transplanting. There is a practical mindset in Amish farming communities that one neighbor in Lancaster County described to me as simply not letting the problem start. He said, his grandfather used to tell him that a fence is cheaper than a chase, meaning it takes far less work to keep a pest out than to fight it once it is already feeding on your plants. That is not romantic philosophy. That is a calculation born from necessity. When you are feeding a large family without synthetic chemicals and without running to the garden center every weekend, you learn to prevent problems rather than react to them, and the physical barrier is the most reliable prevention tool they have. Now let me walk you through exactly how to build this system. The first thing you need to understand is the frame, because the frame is what makes the difference between an Amish barrier that lasts all season and the flimsy row cover setup that collapses the first time the wind picks up. The Amish gardeners I learned from use hoops made from 9-gauge galvanized wire, not the thin, lightweight wire you find in most garden kits. 9-gauge is thick enough to hold its shape under wind and rain, but flexible enough to bend into a smooth arch by hand. You can find 9-gauge galvanized wire at most farm supply stores, and a 100-foot roll typically costs between $8 and $12. That single roll will cover 3 to 4 standard garden beds. Here's exactly how to make the hoops. Cut the wire into lengths of 5 to 6 feet, depending on how wide your bed is. For a standard 3 to 4 foot wide raised bed, a 5.5 foot piece of wire works perfectly. Bend each piece into a U shape and push both ends about 6 inches into the soil on opposite sides of the bed. The top of the arch should sit about 18 to 20 inches above the soil surface. That gives your plants room to grow underneath without pressing against the fabric. Space your hoops every 3 feet along the length of the bed, so for a 12-foot bed, you would use 5 hoops. The key here is consistency. Evenly spaced hoops create a smooth, even surface for the fabric to rest on, which prevents sagging pockets where wind catches and tears the material. If you are gardening in zones 3 through 5 where late spring winds can be fierce, push your wire ends 8 inches into the soil instead of 6, and consider adding a horizontal ridge wire along the top. Just run a single piece of wire lengthwise across all the hoop tops and use small twist ties to secure it. This gives the whole structure backbone and keeps it rigid in 30 to 40 mile-per-hour gusts. I added ridge wires to my own setup after losing 2 covers in a spring storm my second year, and the difference was immediate. Now that your frame is solid, here is where the actual pest protection happens, and this is where most people make a critical mistake. The choice of fabric matters more than most gardeners realize. The Amish families I visited almost universally use what is called lightweight spun-bonded fabric, not the heavier frost protection blankets that many garden centers sell as row cover. There is an important difference. Lightweight fabric, around 0.5 to 0.6 ounces per square yard, lets in roughly 85% of sunlight and allows rain to pass through freely. It breathes, so heat does not build up dangerously underneath. Heavy frost blankets, those thick white sheets rated for freeze protection, block too much light for season-long use and trap heat that can cook your plants by midsummer. When you buy your fabric, look for the weight rating on the package. You want something labeled as insect barrier or lightweight row cover, typically around ½ an ounce per square yard. Avoid anything labeled as frost blanket or heavy weight unless you are specifically using it for early spring freeze protection and plan to swap it out. Cut your fabric about 18 inches wider and 2 feet longer than your bed on all sides. You need that extra material to create a proper seal at ground level, which I will cover in detail in the bonus tip at the end. For now, drape the fabric over your hoops so it hangs evenly on both sides and extends past the ends of the bed. Here is what the conventional approach looks like compared to the Amish method. Most gardeners I have talked to, and I did this myself for years, drape a piece of fabric loosely over their plants with no frame at. All weigh the edges down with a few rocks and call it done. Within a week, the fabric is resting directly on the leaves, creating contact points where pests can actually feed right through the material. The wind pulls it loose on one side, bugs crawl underneath, and the whole thing becomes useless. The Amish approach uses a proper frame that keeps the fabric elevated off the plants at all times and a secure ground seal that leaves no gaps for crawling insects to exploit. The frame is the difference between a barrier that works and a barrier that just looks like it is working. This next part is what separates a good barrier from a great one, and it is all about timing. The Amish do not put their barriers up the day they notice pests. They install them the same day they transplant or within 24 to 48 hours of direct seeding. This is crucial. Most pest damage to vegetable crops happens in the first 3 to 4 weeks after planting. Young transplants have soft stems and tender leaves that are magnets for flea beetles, aphids, cabbage moths, and cucumber beetles. Once those pests find your plants and begin laying eggs, you are fighting an exponential population explosion. By installing the barrier at planting time, before a single pest arrives, you protect the plants through their most vulnerable window. The Amish father I learned from in Lancaster County put it simply. He said you do not lock the door after the fox is in the henhouse. You lock it before. Here is the timing guidance by zone. In zones 3 through 5, install barriers immediately after your last frost date transplanting, typically late May through early June. In zones 6 and 7, you can begin as early as mid-April for cool season crops like broccoli and cabbage, and late April to mid-May for warm season crops like squash and peppers. In zones 8 and 9, your first barrier installation may be as early as late February or March for spring plantings. The principle is the same everywhere. The barrier goes on the day the plants go in. No exceptions. If you are picking up what I am laying down and you want more of these deep dives into traditional growing methods that actually work, hit subscribe. I have got a lot more of these coming, and each one goes just as deep as this. All right, let us keep going. Now, here is where most people run into the one question that trips them up. What about pollination? If you seal your squash and cucumbers under a barrier, how do the bees get in? This is a legitimate concern, and the Amish handle it with a simple timing adjustment that works every single time. For crops that need pollination, which is mainly your squash, cucumbers, melons, and pumpkins, you keep the barrier sealed from transplanting until the plants begin to flower. In most zones, that is roughly 3 to 4 weeks for summer squash and 4 to 6 weeks for cucumbers and melons. Once you see the first open blossoms, you remove the barrier entirely. Or, and this is what the Amish family I learned from preferred, you open the barrier each morning and close it again each evening. The reasoning is straightforward. Most pollinating insects are active during daytime hours, roughly from 8 in the morning through late afternoon. Most destructive pests, particularly egg-laying moths like the cabbage moth, are either active at dawn and dusk or at night. By opening the barrier during peak pollination hours and closing it in the evening, you get pollination access while maintaining nighttime and early morning protection. For crops that do not require pollination, your lettuce, kale, broccoli, cabbage, herbs, root vegetables, the barrier can stay sealed from planting day until harvest. This is where the system really shines. I have grown entire crops of broccoli and kale under sealed barriers without a single cabbage worm touching them. Not one. The conventional approach of spraying BT or picking caterpillars off by hand every morning simply cannot match that level of protection. This fifth piece of the system is about maintenance, and it is the part that most guides skip over entirely. A pest barrier is not a set-it-and-forget-it solution. It requires a weekly check, and the Amish are diligent about this. Every 5 to 7 days, lift the fabric and inspect your plants. You are looking for 3 things. First, check that no pests have gotten trapped inside the barrier. It happens occasionally, especially if a pest was already in the soil as a larva when you installed the cover. If you find aphids or caterpillars inside, hand pick them and drop them in soapy water. Second, check the ground seal. Wind, watering, and animal activity can loosen the edges over time. Resecure any spots where the fabric has pulled away from the soil. A gap of even 2 inches is enough for cucumber beetles to find their way in. Third, check the fabric itself for tears or holes. A sharp hoop end, a curious squirrel, or just normal wear can create small openings. Patch any holes immediately with a small piece of fabric and a safety pin. The Amish gardeners I have watched keep a few safety pins tucked right into the edge of the fabric for exactly this purpose. Quick, simple, effective. The whole inspection takes about 5 minutes per bed. Pair it with your regular morning garden walk and it adds almost nothing to your routine. Now let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do the conventional way that the Amish barrier approach handles differently. The first pattern is waiting for pest damage before taking action. This is the one I was guilty of for the longest time. I would see holes in my cabbage leaves, identify the pest, research the solution, buy a product, and apply it, all while the pest population was growing every single day. The Amish barrier prevents the pest from ever reaching the plant in the first place. Prevention, not reaction. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but most of us have to unlearn the reactive habit. The second pattern is relying on a single defense. I see a lot of gardeners who pick one approach, maybe companion planting or maybe beneficial insects, and expect it to handle everything. The Amish use barriers as the first layer of a system. The barrier handles the heaviest pest pressure during the critical early weeks. Companion planting, healthy soil, beneficial insects, and hand-picking handle whatever comes after the barrier is removed or opened. No single method does everything, but the barrier does the heaviest lifting during the window that matters most. The third pattern is buying expensive pre-made barrier kits. Garden centers sell row cover kits with thin fiberglass hoops and lightweight fabric for $30 to $50 per bed. Those hoops snap in wind. The fabric is usually too short to seal properly at the edges, and the whole thing needs replacing every season. The Amish build their hoops from 9-gauge wire that lasts for a decade and Buy fabric in bulk rolls for a fraction of the kit price. My entire setup covering 6 beds cost me less than $40 and is now in its 4th season with the same wire hoops. I replaced the fabric once at a cost of about $12 for a full roll. The 4th pattern is removing the barrier too early. I see gardeners get impatient in early summer and pull their covers off as soon as the weather warms up, thinking the pest pressure is over. In most zones, the worst pest pressure is actually mid-June through late July. Keep your barriers on through the full vulnerable period for each crop. For brassicas, that often means keeping them covered until harvest. For squash and cucumbers, keep them sealed until flowering begins, then switch to the morning open, evening close routine I described earlier. Now, here's the technique I promised you at the beginning, the one that solves the biggest weakness in most barrier setups, and I have never seen it in a commercial gardening guide. The #1 failure point of any fabric barrier is the ground seal. If the edges of your fabric are not tight against the soil, crawling pests walk right underneath. Most gardeners use rocks, bricks, or soil piled on the edges. Rocks shift. Bricks leave gaps at the corners. Soil works but makes it tedious to lift the fabric for inspections and harvesting because you have to rebury the edges every time. The Amish family I learned this from uses sand-filled tubes made from old pantyhose or thin fabric scraps. Here is exactly how to make them. Take an old pair of pantyhose or cut a strip of lightweight fabric about 3 inches wide and 3 to 4 feet long. Fill it with sand, about 1 to 1.5 pounds per foot of length. Tie off the ends. You now have a flexible, heavy tube that conforms perfectly to uneven ground. Lay these tubes along the entire perimeter of your fabric, right where it meets the soil surface. The sand tubes are heavy, enough to hold the fabric down in moderate wind, but light enough to lift with one hand when you need to inspect or harvest. They conform to bumps, dips, and uneven soil in ways that rigid bricks and rocks never will. There are no gaps at the corners because the tubes bend around them, and because they are flexible, they press the fabric into every low spot along the edge, creating a seal that crawling pests simply cannot breach. I made 12 of these tubes in about 20 minutes using old socks and sand from a leftover bag of play sand. Total cost, nothing. They have lasted 3 full seasons with no signs of breaking down. After I switched from rocks to sand tubes, I went from finding the occasional cucumber beetle inside my barriers to finding none. 0. That ground seal was the missing piece, and it is the kind of quiet, practical solution that you only learn from watching someone who has been doing this for generations. That is the complete Amish pest barrier system. Build a sturdy wire frame that holds the fabric off your plants. Choose lightweight spun-bonded fabric rated around ½ ounce per square yard. Install the barrier on the same day you plant, before a single pest arrives. Use the morning open, evening close method for crops that need pollination. Inspect weekly for trapped pests, edge gaps, and fabric tears. And seal the ground edges with flexible sand-filled tubes that leave no entry point for crawling insects. If any of this changed how you think about protecting your garden, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what pests have been giving you the most trouble and whether you are going to try this system this season. And if you want more of these practical deep dives into traditional growing methods from cultures that figured this out long before we had a garden center on every corner, hit subscribe. I have got a lot more of these coming. Thanks for spending time with me today. I will see you in the next one.